Chapter 1. What is philosophy of religion? Given the nature of its subject, religion is an issue of intense concern for every reflective person, whether one ultimately rejects its validity or not, because it addresses and offers answers to the most fundamental questions of human existence. Despite periodic announcements by secularist thinkers that humanity has finally come of age and no longer has any use for religion, most human beings are still vitally concerned with such questions as, is there a God? Why does God allow suffering? And what happens to a person at death? These and other questions posed by great religions of the world are grounded in some of the deepest human desires, hopes, and fears. Accordingly, religion has long been an important force in human life and human history, and there is every reason to believe it will continue to be so throughout the foreseeable future. Philosophy of religion can perhaps best be defined in a preliminary way as the attempt to think hard and deeply about such fundamental questions as the one just mentioned. In saying that philosophy of religion focuses on these questions, we mean, of course, to say that the answers given by various religions are also to be the object of attention. Philosophy of religion is therefore critical reflection on religious beliefs. To explain why the focus of philosophy of religion is on religious beliefs, it would be helpful to say a little more about both philosophy and religion. Philosophy and religion are sometimes viewed as rivals, and the relations between them have not always been cordial. Some of the reasons for this mutual suspicion will become clear as we proceed. The questions, what is philosophy and what is religion, are surprisingly difficult to answer. Such complex human activities can be defined in many different ways. Indeed, it is possible to define philosophy and religion in such a way that they become mutually exclusive rivals. Religious believers sometimes have viewed philosophers as unsympathetic critics who try to undermine religious faith. To the believer, the philosopher may appear as presumptuous champion of human reason who rejects divine wisdom. Conversely, philosophers sometimes viewed religious believers as benighted defenders of superstition and blind obedience to authority. While these kinds of conflicts have certainly occurred, and though tensions between philosophy and religion remain, it would be a great mistake to embody such oppositions in the very definitions of philosophy and religion. Conflict is not inevitable. Some of the greatest philosophers have been religious believers, and some of the greatest contributions to religious thought have come from philosophers, religious and non-religious. The question of whether religion is reasonable indeed, the question of whether it should even try to be, is among the questions which philosophy of religion aims to answer. Such inquiries should not be settled in a premature fashion by the way we define our terms. Religion is a complicated and rich human phenomenon, and as such it is studied by academians from such disciplines: historians, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and theologians, to name a few. Religion touches on the whole of a human existence. A practicing adherent of a particular religion has not only certain characteristic beliefs, but also characteristic emotions, attitudes, and experiences. The believer usually associates with other believers in a community that may be relatively loose or extraordinarily tight-knit. The believer usually acts differently from the non-believer. He engages in worship and other religious exercises. He may attempt to follow a set of rules or principles throughout life. He may take as a role model the life of the founder of the religion. Religion can by no means, then, be reduced to a purely intellectual phenomenon. A religion is not simply a set of beliefs or dogmas. Nevertheless, most religions at least include some distinguishing set of beliefs. A religious person does not merely have different feelings or attitudes or even action. She thinks differently about herself and her world. She worships as part of a community, and that community is defined in part by its beliefs. It is natural for this belief element of religion to catch the eye of the philosopher. Philosophy has always been understood as a search for wisdom or knowledge. The philosopher is a seeker of truth. She wants to know whether religious beliefs are untrue, and whether they can be known to be true or reasonably believed to be true. In considering these religious beliefs, of course, the philosopher ought not to wrench them out of context, but to see them in relation to other elements of religious life. Philosophers have not always followed this rule. The philosopher's main interest, however, will be such religious beliefs as God created the world, and human beings are destined for eternal life. Philosophy of religion and other disciplines. This focus on the truth and reasonableness of religious belief helps distinguish philosophy of religion from other academic disciplines that study religion. While the historian or sociologist may also study religious beliefs, His focus is not specifically on the truth or reasonableness of such beliefs. False beliefs may be as important as true ones to the historian or sociologist who tries to paint a picture of the history of religion or the place of religion in society. The distinction between philosopher of religion and theologian is trickier. Theology is an activity carried on within religion, at least in theory. Thus, the theologian looks at religious beliefs from within as inherent or representative of a religious tradition. Philosophy of religion, on the other hand, as critical reflection on religious questions and beliefs, may be engaged in by thinkers who are not themselves religious at all, as well as by committed religious thinkers. We will shortly deal with the question as to whether this critical reflection can and should be done from a neutral perspective. This initial distinction between theology and philosophy of religion is not quite acceptable as it stands, primarily because there is more than one kind of theology. What was said previously applies at least roughly to the theologian of an actual religion. For example, Christian theology includes the overlapping categories of dogmatic theology, biblical theology, and systematic theology. A theologian who engages in any of these may in fact do some philosophy of religion, but that is not her main business. There is also, however, the kind of theology called natural theology, sometimes called philosophical theology, in which the theologian attempts to say what can be known about God or things divine from any commitment to a particular religion, claims to special revelation, and so on. Natural theology in this sense cannot be sharply separated from philosophy of religion, inasmuch as a good part of philosophy of religion consists in defenses of or attacks on natural theology. Still, the two disciplines are not example. As can be seen from the fact that one of the issues in philosophy of religion is whether natural theology is truly vital to religion, as well as whether it can be successfully carried out. Philosophy of religion as a task will still be necessary even if natural theology is abandoned. Philosophy of religion and philosophy. In addition to distinguishing philosophy of religion from theology and from the empirical disciplines that study religion as factual, history, psychology, anthropology, and sociology, it is important to distinguish philosophy of religion from religious philosophies. To draw this distinction, a little more must be said about philosophy in general. It is pointed out by philosophers that the question, what is philosophy, is itself part of philosophy. Philosophers do not agree among themselves about what philosophy is. Hence, it is probably impossible to give a completely neutral definition of philosophy, a definition which does not itself presuppose some philosophical commitments. Some philosophers attempt to get around the obvious substantive disagreements among philosophers by specifying some supposedly neutral method of answering the questions of philosophy. This method can be assumed as the common ground in terms of which philosophy can be defined. Unfortunately, however, there is almost as much disagreement about the proper method for philosophy as about the conclusions of philosophy. Rationalists propose that philosophy should restrict itself to a method of deductive proof. Linguistic philosophers think philosophy should consist of the analysis of language, and phenomenologists argue that philosophy should concern itself with the description of lived experience. None of these methods really appears to be purely neutral, because when unpacked, each invariably presupposes a particular view of reason and language of experience. Perhaps a beginning can be made by noting what we have already claimed, and what all different schools of philosophy seem to admit. Philosophy is a rational enterprise. Whatever else it may be, philosophy is a reflective activity. Philosophy is a kind of thinking. Of course, not every kind of thinking will qualify as philosophical. No one would dignify one's thinking about what kind of toothpaste to use with the label philosophy. The thinking we call philosophy is unusually serious kind of thinking, directed to especially serious kinds of problems. Certain kinds of questions seem to be asked by almost all human beings who have reached a certain level of reflectiveness. Who am I? What kind of world do I live in? What is worth living for? These foundational questions have a universal significance, and they properly inspire the deepest and most rigorous kind of thinking. Answers to them, especially when those answers are comprehensive and organized, are called philosophies, and the activity of seriously wrestling with these questions is called philosophy. Some of the organized systematic answers to basic human questions have an undeniably religious flavor to them. In some cases, the answers are taken directly from a religious tradition. Other philosophies seem to have developed in response to religion. They seek to answer the same questions and meet the same needs, and therefore may be seen as rivals to religion. Both types of philosophies may properly be called religious. Religious philosophy, then, is philosophical thinking which is religious in inspiration or direction. Religious philosophy, in this sense, is not identical to philosophy of religion. As a form of reflection, philosophy is always self-conscious and critical. The philosopher not only builds systems of thought, he critically reflects on those systems. It is this critical and reflective side of philosophy that is most evident in philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion is not so much religious thinking as it is thinking about religion, a thinking which can be carried on by both religious and non-religious persons. Can thinking about religion be neutral? We have differentiated philosophy of religion from theology and religious philosophy by describing it as a reflective activity that requires a certain critical distance from its subject. In comparison with theology and religious philosophy, philosophy of religion appears to aim for a neutral stance. But is such neutrality with respect to religious matters really possible? Some religious thinkers have denied that it is, claiming, for example, that a human being cannot be neutral with respect to God. They claim that a person who is not properly submissive to God is by default in rebellion against God. He who is not for us is against us. Even more radically, one might challenge the assumption that such neutrality is even desirable. Might it not be that a neutral, disinterested posture actually precludes a deep understanding of what religion is about? Posing these questions puts us right into the heart of a central question in philosophy of religion and theology, the problem of the relation of faith to reason. One's view of faith and reason largely determines whether one sees philosophy and religion as inevitably hostile to each other, as coexisting peacefully but independently, or as possible allies. Chapter 8 attempts to deal with this issue more fully, but is necessary for two reasons to say something about it at the very outset of a book such as this. First, some religious believers hold a view of faith and reason which claims that rational reflection on religion is impossible, useless, or even harmful. In effect, they call into question the very legitimacy of philosophy of religion. Hence, some consideration of their view is in order if they are to be truly reflective and critical. Second, it seems only fair to try to become clear, and to help the reader become clear about the standpoint taken by this book. What kind of thinking about religion is going on in these pages? We will approach this first issue first, returning to it in Chapter 8 by sketching two opposing viewpoints, fideism and neutralism. These we will criticize and reject. We will then propose an alternative that, hopefully, will preserve the strengths and eliminate the weakness on the initial theories. This constructive proposal will be termed critical dialogue. Chapter 2, The Theistic God, the Project of Natural Theology. A belief in God or gods of some kind is central to the great majority of the world's religions. Obviously, then, two key questions for philosophy of religion are whether it is reasonable to believe in God, and if so, what kind of God should be believed in. Concepts of God. Though there are a great number of views about God, which vary tremendously in the details, most views about God can be seen as falling into one of a relatively small number of types. Polytheism, the belief that there exists a plurality of personal gods, is common among tribal peoples and is clearly present in Greek and Nordic mythology. Henotheism also recognizes a plurality of gods, but the henotheist restricts his allegiance to one god, either because he sees that God in some way is superior to the others, or simply because that God is the God of his own tribe or people. Monotheism, often simply abbreviated as theism, holds that only one God exists. God is seen as a personal being, supreme in power, knowledge, and moral worth, who created all other existing beings out of nothing. Pantheism, often associated with varieties of Hinduism and other Eastern religions, but not uncommon in the West, holds that it is not ultimately proper to think of God as a personal being, or according to some as a being of any kind. Such concepts are thought to be too limiting for God, who must ultimately be understood as identical with nature or the universe as a whole. Panentheism says that God is not identical with the universe, but must be seen as including the universe. The universe is in some sense God, but God is more than the universe. These are the two major views about God that are found in the religions of the world. There are, of course, many interesting variations on each view. some of which are significant enough to warrant a name. Thus, dualism can be seen as a variation on polytheism, the dualist holding to a plurality of only two gods who are opposed to each other. Usually one god is seen as good and the other as evil. Deism, in one of its senses, can be understood as a variation on theism. The deist believes in one God, like the theist believes that this God cannot or does not involve himself in his creation. Absolute monism can be seen as a variation on pantheism or panentheism. The absolute monist holds that God is an absolute unity which is somehow manifested in a less than fully real world of apparent plurality. A list of views about God also includes views which reject belief in God. Agnosticism holds that the truth about God cannot be or is not known, and that people should therefore suspend judgment on the question. Atheism goes further and actually denies the existence of God. Naturalism is a worldview that entails atheism. The naturalist does not believe in any supernatural realm beyond nature. She believes that the natural order of things simply exists on its own. More will be said about the naturalistic worldview later. However, while atheism is a belief held by many anti-religious people, it is also sometimes held by religious people. The Theravada variety of Buddhism appears to be atheistic, and some atheists have attempted to put forward a humanistic religion of men, which would not involve a belief in God of any kind. The theistic concept of God. Of all the various views of God, monotheism, henceforth theism for short, holds a special importance. It is the dominant view of God in three of the world's great religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Views of God that seem to approximate theism are also found among a significant number of Hindus, and traces or suggestions of such a view can be found in the writings of some of the great philosophers of ancient Greece and in many other religions as well. The reasonableness of theism seems therefore to be an issue well worth considering. Before attempting this, however, we need to say a little more about what a theistic conception of God involves. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there has emerged a reasonably well-defined list of characteristics that are seen as being essential to God. Some of the attributes on the list are more central than others, and a person rejecting one or more of them might be recognized as holding to theism or a variation of it. But there is a good deal of agreement about what God, if he exists, is like. Whatever else he may be, God is conceived as being worthy of worship, the supreme object of religious devotion. This requirement seems to have played a key role in the refinement of the theistic concept of God. It seems to be a minimal requirement for a being worthy of absolute devotion and worship that he be greater than any other being. No other being exceeds God in power, knowledge, or goodness, but theism makes a stronger claim, holding not only that God is greater than all other being, as a matter of fact, but that it is impossible for there to be a being greater than God. God's power, knowledge, and goodness are therefore seen not merely as being very great, but rather as being maximal. God is omnipotent. He possesses all the power that a being can possibly have. God is omniscient. He knows everything that is possible for a being to know. God is morally perfect. His goodness is unsurpassable. Another way of expressing God's greatness is to say that he is infinite or unlimited. These terms, however, must be understood in a qualified sense. To say that God is infinite in power does not mean that he can literally do anything. It has usually been held, for example, that God cannot create a square circle, bring it about that 2 + 2 = 5. Many, though not all, theists would add that he cannot create a person with a morally free will who is determined always to choose what is morally right. The reason for this is not that God lacks some power or ability he might have had, but that these conceptions are logically contradictory, and therefore impossible or even meaningless. God's power is the power to bring about anything that is logically possible. In addition, most theists hold that there are certain things God cannot do because of his nature. Being morally perfect, he cannot commit an act of senseless cruelty, for example. God's omnipotence must then be understood as the power to do whatever is logically possible and consistent with God's own essential characteristics. Similar restrictions may have to be placed on the concept of omniscience. Even with these qualifications, God's power is still infinite in the sense of being unlimited by anything outside himself. God in no way limited by or dependent on any other being. For this reason, God is often described as a necessary being. God does not just happen to exist. Since God does not depend for his existence on anything else, and since nothing can threaten his existence, his non-existence is not really possible. Theists have understood this necessity in two different ways. Some have held that God's existence is logically necessary. On this view, God does not exist is thought to express an impossible state of affairs, even if it might seem to be a conceivable one. Others have held that God's necessity is simply grounded in his power and independence. Nothing can in fact threaten God's existence, so his existence is factually necessary, even if his non-existence is broadly logically possible. Another way of putting this to say that God is self-existent, meaning literally that his existence depends on nothing outside of himself. Sometimes the medieval term aseity is used to denote the characteristics of self-existence. As God is a necessary being, he is not just another being, but he is a being in some sense on the traditional theistic account. Not only that, but he is a being of a certain type with a particular nature. God is not just being itself, as some philosophers have alleged. Some descriptions fail to do justice to the personal character of God. The God is personal is implicit in what he has already been said, because only a personal being can have power, knowledge, and moral perfection. To have power is to be able to do things, to act in a certain ways. To know things, a being must be intelligent, have a mind. To be morally perfect is to be perfect in deeds, intentions, and thoughts. Although God certainly surpasses human persons in many respects, and some theists insist that God is more than personal, it is clear that God cannot be less than personal, and it is not clear what it would be like for a being to be more than personal. We can put the point cautiously by saying, of all the things humans are experiencing in creation, God most resembles a person. Since God is personal, it is appropriate to understand him as acting. God's primary action is usually understood as that of creation. That God is a creator means not only, or even primarily, that whatever has a beginning was begun by God, but that whatever exists at any moment exists because of God's will and creative sustaining power. Everything that exists other than God depends on God for its existence, a relationship that is properly stated by describing God as creator and all other things as creations. The term creature is often used to refer more specifically to the parts of the creation that are conscious. As creator, God is therefore continuously active in his creation. The denial of this is a move in the direction of deism. This is not to deny a certain autonomy and integrity to the created order, but it does imply that whatever occurs does so because God wills it or permits it to occur. God is everywhere, present within his creation in the sense that he can and does bring about some events immediately, and that he knows what occurs everywhere in the same immediate manner. Therefore, it is a mistake to think of God as limited to one region of space. He is properly thought of as omnipresent, present everywhere by virtue of his activity and knowledge. Theists have traditionally agreed that this implies that God has no body, he is a spirit. Just as God is not limited by space, so he is in some way or other, not limited by time. God is an eternal spirit. There are some important differences in the way theists have understood God's being eternal. Many have thought of eternity as timelessness. On this view, God is thought of as having no temporal succession. No, before and after, in his existence, he is outside of time altogether. Others have understood divine eternality to mean that God is everlasting. On this view, God, like us, in time, in philosophical jargon, he is temporarily located, but unlike us, his existence is without beginning or end. In short, God has always existed, and he always will exist. Note the temporal connotation of these phrases. If they are true of God, he is outside of time. He is not outside of time. He still is not limited by time in the sense that 1. It takes him no time to carry out his actions, 2. His plans and purposes cannot be dimmed and frustrated by passage of time, and 3. He never desires to change the past. This divergence of views about the nature of God's eternality is also reflected in differing views about the degree to which God does not change. Obviously, a perfect being must possess the degree of stability. A being of fickle character must be unworthy of worship. But some classical theists who think of God as timelessly eternal hold to a stronger view, that God is absolutely unchangeable or immutable. On this view, change of any kind is compatible with perfection. Other theists have understood divine immutability as referring less radically to God's character and purposes. These never change, though God is capable of modifying his responses and actions in light of his awareness of what is presently going on in his creation. This, then, is a brief recounting of the theistic concept of God. God is an eternal, self-existent spirit, unchangeable at least in his basic character and purposes, who exists necessarily. He is a personal being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. He is the creator of all things other than himself, and he is omnipresent in his creation, though without a body. In recent years, philosophers have done a good deal of interesting work developing and refining these concepts. One of the central problems addressed in this discussion is whether all of the traditional attributes can be applied to God consistently. Atheists often allege that theism can be disproved by taking some attribute of God and demonstrating that either individually or in combination with other attributes, some absurdity results when the implications of this attribute are worked out to their logical conclusions. If the concept of God is incoherent, then no being could possibly exemplify this concept, in which case theism is false. A similar strategy tries to show that some divine attributes are in conflict with other basic theological doctrines. Doctrines about human nature, for example, or God's relation to human beings. The limits of this book do not allow us to explore each of these various debates. However, in the following section, we will look briefly at one of the debates which has received much attention recently, in order to get a feel for the character and significance of these kinds of discussions. Natural theology. As we have already pointed out, theism is held in common by Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The relation between theism and a particular religion, like Christianity, is as follows. If Christianity is true, then theism is true. The converse does not hold, that is, the truth of Christianity does not follow from the truth of theism. But if theism is true, Christianity may be true, and one might even claim that the possibility of Christianity's being true is increased. At the very least, one reason for thinking Christianity to be false is eliminated if theism is true. Philosophers interested in the reasonableness of religion like Christianity have therefore often proceeded by first attempting to determine the truth of theism. The idea seems to be that one should first establish the truth of theism and then proceed to determine which, if any, of the theistic religions is true. First, one must determine whether God exists, and then one can go on to ask whether God has revealed himself through special events and people. This attempt to determine the truth of theism without assuming the standpoint of a particular religion we shall term natural theology. The natural theologian attempts to see what can be known about God independently of any special religious authority. The potential value of natural theology for religious apologetics is evident, since it will be far easier to argue that some individual or book is a revelation from God if it is antecedently known or probable that there is a God. Although natural theology seems worth pursuing, it is by no means evident that this is the best way of coming to know about God, and it certainly would not appear to be the only way. Religious believers typically come to believe in God as a result of, or in the process of, coming to believe in Christianity or some other theistic religion. In what follows, we will take Christianity as an example of a theistic religion. The cumbersome phrase, or some other theistic religion, will be omitted, but is implied nonetheless. They may come to believe in God by accepting Jesus as one who reveals God, or does not have to first believe in God and then afterward become a Christian. The two may occur simultaneously, and logically the reasons for thinking that theism is true may be the reasons for thinking that Christianity is true. It is not evident, then, that the success of natural theology is crucial to religious belief. Many Christian theologians, especially Protestants, actually have been hostile to natural theology. Such hostility sometimes stems from the kind of fideism discussed in Chapter 1, and indeed, fideism and rejection of natural theology often are confusedly rolled together. However, a religious believer could reject natural theology without being a fideist. To avoid fideism, it is necessary only for the believer to accept legitimacy of critical reflection on one's belief by analyzing them in light of all the evidence and in comparison with alternative views. It is not required that one abstract the core beliefs, theism, from a total set of religious beliefs, such as Christianity, in a way that treats the core beliefs in isolation or ignores the distinctive beliefs of one's religion. Actually, the distinction between natural theology and revealed theology is not so easy to make as one might think. The believer who rejects natural theology usually claims to know about God because he has experienced God or because God has revealed himself either directly or through special people, events, or sacred writings, often accompanied by miracles or other special signs. It would seem possible, however, to regard such experiences and revelations, if they occur, as a kind of evidence for God's existence. And indeed, may natural theologians have developed arguments for God's existence from miracles or from religious experience. In principle, such arguments could be developed without presupposing the truth of any particular religion or religious authority, and they would therefore qualify as natural theology by our definition. If this reasoning is sound, then it may imply that the concept of natural theology is not at all clear, and that no sharp line can be drawn between natural theology and other kinds of theology. Whether or not this is the case, it seems that there is an important initial distinction to be drawn between believing in God on the basis of arguments which take as their starting point general features of nature or human experience, and believing in God on the basis of highly specific experiences or events. Even though the latter kind of evidence can be formulated into arguments, most natural theologians have focused on the former kind of argument, and there is a further significant difference. The natural theologian who begins from general features of nature usually aims to arrive only at the subset of religious beliefs called theism. The person who believes in God on the basis of a historical revelation accompanied by miracles is much more likely to accept theism only as a part of a more inclusive set of beliefs. In any case, we shall proceed in the remainder of this chapter and in the next chapter to look at natural theology and the traditional sense of arguments for God's existence that appeal to general features of human existence. Then in chapter 4, we shall look at religious experiences and other particular means of coming to know God. Proofs of God's existence. One way the project of natural theology has been formulated is in the question of whether God's existence can be proved. Many philosophers have developed arguments that purport to such proofs. Many others have attempted to find flaws in these arguments. Before attempting to explain some of these arguments and evaluate their success as proofs, it is necessary to say something about arguments and how they might be judged successful. Philosophers usually think of an argument as a set of statements or propositions, the premises, which show that another statement, the conclusion, is true, or which render it probable that the conclusion is true. Arguments can be either deductive or inductive. A good deductive argument is one in which the premises entail the conclusion. This relation holds when it is impossible that the conclusion to be false if the premises are all true. A good inductive argument is one in which the premises render the conclusion likely to be true. The more probable it is that the conclusion is true, given the truth of the premises, the stronger the inductive argument. Most arguments given the philosophers for the existence of God have been deductive arguments, although some important contemporary philosophers have put forward inductive arguments. It is important to see that there are at least three distinct ways of assessing the value of a particular deductive argument. These three ways give us three questions that can be asked about an argument. Is it valid? Is it sound? Does the argument function as a successful proof? We will assess these criteria in order. Validity is a term used by logicians in evaluating the formal structure of an argument. An argument is valid whenever the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. In other words, it is valid just in case the premises entail the conclusion. The following is an example of a valid argument. 1. All people from Georgia always speak with a Southern accent. 2. C. Stephen Evans is from Georgia. 3. Therefore, C. Stephen Evans always speaks with a Southern accent. Although this argument is valid, the conclusion is false, since C. Stephen Evans rarely speaks with a Southern accent. The argument is valid because the conclusion would be true if the premises were true, but in this case, premise 1 is false. An argument is sound if it is valid and all the premises of the argument are true. If an argument is sound, then its conclusion is true. Presumably, those who want to prove God's existence will want, as a minimum, arguments that are sound. It is clear, however, that the logical criteria of validity and soundness are not enough to characterize a successful proof of God's existence. There are at least two closely related ways that a sound argument might fail as a successful proof. First, it is possible for an argument to be sound without anyone's knowing it to be sound. This could happen if, for example, an argument contained a premise whose truth value was unknown. Consider the following. 1. The closest as yet discovered planet is orbited by 2 moons. Therefore, the closest as yet undiscovered planet is orbited by more than 1 moon. Obviously, the argument is valid, and the premise might happen to be true. If it is true, then the definition the argument is sound, valid with true premise. Nevertheless, no one should find this argument convincing in the least for the obvious reason that no one is in a position to know the first premise to be true. It is built into the premise that the planet in question is at present unknown. Likewise, a sound argument for God's existence will not be valuable, unless all of its premises are, or at least can be, known to be true. This brings us to the second way that sound argument can fail. Consider the following examples. 1. There are humans. 2. Either there are no humans or God exists. 3. Hence God exists. This argument is logically valid. Any argument of the form 1. Either P or Q. 2. Not P. 3. Therefore Q is valid, and this argument can be reduced to that form. Furthermore, the argument may even be sound. It certainly is if God exists, and some people might even know that it is sound. Anyone who knows that God exists can know that this argument is sound. Nevertheless, the argument will convince no one. It is altogether easy to articulate precisely what is wrong with the argument, but intuitively the problem is pretty obvious. The only people who would accept the second premise are that those who already accept the argument's conclusion. But to be persuasive, the premises must be known to be true on grounds independent of the conclusion. Only in this way could the argument ever change someone's mind or add conviction to an already held opinion. Only in this way could it rationally convincing and function as a successful proof. 2 lessons then can be drawn from this example. First, an argument will fail to be a convincing proof if it employs premises that are just as controversial as, or more controversial than, its conclusion. Second, an argument will fail as a convincing proof if the premises, even if they are known by some people, are not known by intended audience, the individuals to whom the argument is presented and meant to convince. We have seen, then, that whether an argument is a successful proof depends not only on whether the argument is logically sound, but also on whether, how, and by whom the argument is known to be sound. To whom should an argument be rationally convincing, if it is to be a successful proof? An argument rationally convincing to even one person would possibly be valuable to that person. If this definition of proof is adopted, then it seems plausible to claim that God's existence can indeed be proven for reasons that will emerge in Chapter 3. Some philosophers would not be happy with such a definition of a proof, however. They have been troubled by the thought that individuals often are mistaken in their beliefs. If one individual claimed to find an argument for God's existence rationally convincing, but nobody else found that argument rationally convincing, surely it is likely that the individual is mistaken. These philosophers want to claim that a genuine proof should be rationally convincing to everyone, or at least to all sane and rational people who have had opportunity to consider the argument carefully. If we define a proof of God's existence as an argument that is rationally convincing to all sane, rational persons, then we shall see no proofs of God's existence can be given. This conclusion is neither exciting nor disturbing, however, for anyone who has rejected neutralism. Even if the arguments fail as proofs, they may succeed in other ways and other functions. Furthermore, the claim that in order to know something, one must be able to prove it, in the second sense of proof, is one that carries an implicit commitment to neutralism, for in effect, one is being asked to adopt a totally disinterested standpoint, accepting only those truths which all sane, rational people would accept. It seems unlikely, for the reason given in Chapter 1, that an interesting religious claims can be known or proved in this manner. Hence, the failure to produce a proof of God's existence does not necessarily mean that no one has any justified beliefs about God, nor does it rule out the possibility that some people arrive at such beliefs by rationally convincing arguments. We will consider the possibility of this in Chapter 3 as we examine some specific arguments.